President Zelensky is talking about maybe some need for some divine intervention in terms of these talks. Let's talk a little bit about where we are. You have a useful insight into the progress that is being made. What can you tell us about how far the talks have gone in terms of securing some sort of a lasting peace and how much further there is still to go?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. So we're in the talks already. We have to give them a chance, of course. I'm a little pessimistic as far as their prospects are concerned, but there are certain issues on which we can reach an agreement relatively easy. Those issues concern the neutrality status, for example, as long as we have tangible security guarantees that are given to us, unlike in the Budapest Memorandum. So we're willing to talk about that. There are other issues that are basically non-existent but important for the Russians, something like the Russian language, let's say. So we never had any issues with that, so that's relatively easy. But there are, of course, certain points which are completely off the table. Anything that concerns our sovereignty or territorial integrity, that's never going to be discussed. Now, as far as divine intervention, as you say, that's good. We have to give peace a chance.
Alexander, this is Kriti in New York. Thank you again for joining us. I'm curious about a potential meeting between Zelensky and between Putin. Is that something that is potentially on the table, and do you think that could help perhaps speed up some of the progress in the talks?
Well, certainly we have to do anything that we can to speed up the talks or have any success. We have to give any type of negotiation a chance. Unfortunately, the Russian side hasn't been willing to talk to us directly. The Russian leader hasn't been willing to talk to our president directly for a long time. So we don't see any change in that in that sense, but we have to give it a try.
Alexander, do you think that the Russians are negotiating in good faith? There is an argument that says that they are talking because it provides cover to further their objective on the ground. What do you think to that argument? What do you think about the idea that the Russians are not negotiating in good faith?
Yeah, so this is my fear. I've been saying this for some time. This is, in fact, quite a realistic possibility because we see that what is happening on the ground is not really consistent with what they've been saying in these peace talks. You don't look for peace and intensify bombardments of our cities. These two things don't go together. So there is a serious concern that they're using these peace negotiations as a trick to deceive the West into thinking that peace is around the corner and therefore further sanctions aren't necessary, right? So this could be a sort of strategic ambiguity on their part to signal to the West that, look, we're actually, trying hard here, but in fact, they're just preparing their new offensive. And this is all a deceptive move.
So what can be done to perhaps counteract that? Is that something you're waiting for in terms of sanctions? Is there more that can be done there or more from European governments? What would help, like I said, more progress?
Yeah, so I think this regime has proven over the years that it respects only strength. It only understands the language of strength. It has been deceiving consistently throughout these years. We heard that there was no troops on Crimea. Next day, there were troops on Crimea. In the build-up to this war, we heard this was only a military exercise, and then we saw what happened. So we can't really trust them. What we can do is put pressure on the Russian regime economically. That means increasing further sanctions as far as the revenues from oil and gas sales to Europe are concerned. So an oil embargo, a gas embargo would really help in the sense of bringing Russia's war effort to an end, because Russia's war effort is financed through these sales of gas and oil at this stage. So that's one thing.
Why is Ukraine, okay, Alexander, why is Ukraine allowing Russian gas to transit its territory? If that is the case, if Europe should cut off Russia in terms of an energy supplier, why is Ukraine still facilitating the transit of that gas?
Well, remember, we were also receiving fees over the years for the transit of gas through our territory. So this wasn't happening for free. Now, of course, the reliance of our budget on these revenues on this stream of income is negligible at this stage. And of course, what we care about most is bringing Russia's war effort, Russia's war machine to a halt. And that can be done by putting them into a serial fiscal problem. And that will be done through an oil and gas embargo in Europe.
Well, let me pick up on that topic. If you're talking about transit fees that you're actually getting, how much are you actually getting? And how much are you still waiting for in terms of offsetting perhaps some of the losses of the war?
Well, I mean, you can look up the numbers, but it's at this point, it's insufficient as far as, our actual expenditure needs are concerned. So So what matters here is bringing Russia's war machine to an end. We have a serious fiscal concern too, because our economy is collapsing. We can't really put numbers on this at this stage, but we know that we've given up percentages in terms of GDP growth. So we're really facing a disaster in terms of what's happening to our economy.
Absolutely. We'll come to that in just a moment. It was interesting to hear the Germans today talking about a Marshall Plan. Before we get to that, can I just return to the issue of the talks? There is an ongoing and serious concern, and this is being vocalized by the US president and others, that Russia is prepared to use chemical weapons. If chemical weapons are used, are talks still possible?
Well, I hope this is really a red line if that happens. We've seen episodes in the past where the red lines have been drawn in the conflict in Syria, for example, and then not implemented. So we're obviously wondering in Ukraine what else needs to happen for the world to take this more seriously. If there's use of weapons of mass destruction, of which chemical weapons are one type, then we really hope that nobody will just sit back and watch what happens. Of course, we hope there'll be an intervention. We know that chemical weapons could be used at this stage because Russia is facing serious issues taking our cities. They can't really take our cities without serious losses to their troops or without destroying our cities. And so from a brutal militaristic perspective, the use of chemical weapons could be a solution, inverted commas, to them. But we hope this won't happen, of course.
Well, in terms of the talks, at the start of this interview, you mentioned that the territorial conversations were a hard no from the Ukrainian delegation. But I'm curious about the specific regions of Donetsk and Luhansk in particular. Are those, just given the separatist movement there, is there any wiggle room when it comes to those territories in particular?
Well, as far as we are concerned, we're not going to compromise on our sovereignty. We're not going to compromise on our territories. So there is no wiggle room, as you say. There is perhaps wiggle room to our neutrality status, although, again, we're just saying we're putting off the NATO accession talks for now. NATO has basically said no to us. We're also in the middle of a war. So as long as we're giving security guarantees, we can talk about that. But there's no wiggle room as far as our territory is concerned. And if you ask the people who live there, they're not willing to take any wiggle room. They're not willing to discuss this either.
In terms of the rebuilding of Ukraine, were we to get to a point where it would be possible, the Germans are talking about a Marshall Plan. What would that Marshall Plan need to include? What do you think it would need to look like? Put your economist hat on for a moment.
Well, of course, look, our infrastructure is destroyed. So this would have to be billions and billions, right? We need a really big program for Ukraine that would primarily, in the early stages, be focused on rebuilding our infrastructure. Our bridges, our roads have been completely destroyed in large parts of the country. Actually, they've been just built up recently because President Zelensky had a program that was really focused on infrastructure.
Alexander, do you think joining the EU would be a necessary prerequisite at that point?
Well, joining the EU would, of course, help us because, again, we would be getting funds from the EU. We'll be integrating with the EU. We'll be part of the common market in the EU. Of course, that will help us. But at the same time, we understand that this is not something that happens overnight. We also have to build up our institutions in many respects, our economic institutions, which are still lagging. So we know that. We have to do our homework, and we've been doing our homework in many respects. So joining the EU would definitely help, but it doesn't happen overnight.